Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion and the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Women and Men of American Religion subseries of Religion and the American Experience, a podcast of the Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcast fix, and tell your colleagues, friends, and family about us as well. In this subseries, we explore the women and men who, fueled in large part by their religion, have made significant and broad contributions to the American tapestry. This helps immensely in understanding better what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. Previous episodes include Billy Graham, Elizabeth Seton, Joseph Smith, and Fannie Lou Hamer. Today, we will get to know the life and times of Dr. Betty Shabazz, mother of 6 children, champion of Black America, college administrator, nurse, public health expert, and wife of Nation of Islam minister turned Sunni Muslim leader Malcom X. Dr. Tazeen Ali has agreed to help us with this. Dr. Ali received her PhD in religious studies from Boston University and was a visiting postgraduate student in Islamic studies at the University of Edinburgh. She is currently an assistant professor of religion and politics at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University at St. Louis. Dr. Ali's research and interests include Islam and gender, race and religion, and Muslims in popular culture. Her first book, The Women's Mosque of America, Authority and Community in U.S. Islam, was published in 2022 with New York University Press and analyzes how American Muslim women negotiate the Islamic tradition to cultivate religious authority and build gender-equitable worship communities. Tazeen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Betty was born on May 28, 1934, in either Detroit, Michigan, or Pinehurst, Georgia, to unwed parents, Ollie Mae and Shelman Sandlin. At about age 11, she was adopted by Lorenzo Malloy and Helen Lowe. Can you tell our listeners about Betty's early life, especially how she became adopted and the religiosity of her adopted parents?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I think most accounts place her birth in Georgia and then moving to Detroit pretty early on with her mom, who was neglectful, possibly abusive, and she ends up being adopted by this well-to-do Black couple who are business owners. The story goes she would hang around their shop and they would eventually adopt her when her birth mother kicks her out of the house. I don't think she has much contact with her birth mother after that. So yeah, essentially she's taken in by this couple. They're very loving towards her. And so she essentially grows up very comfortably middle class. And her adopted family, the Malloys, as you mentioned, were very active in the Methodist Church. And so her adopted mother taught at the Sunday school. Her adoptive father was a church officer. So faith was certainly a very important factor in their lives and in her upbringing.
Do we have any understanding of whether she got any religious training from her birth mother?
That's unclear. I think because it's not a relationship that continued after adoption. So I'm not sure. Yeah, that's a good question.
How did the Malloys address Jim Crow, and how did this form Betty's approach to racism?
Yeah, so Betty in her interviews, she talks a lot about being very shielded from racism, and it was something that the Malloys never talked about. She in interviews she's mentioned, it wasn't considered polite, and she actually is um, attests to not really experiencing racism until she was a student in the South at Tuskegee, and even then, it isn't until she meets Malcolm. Um, and folks from the Nation of Islam later on as a nursing student in New York, where she really starts to get the vocabulary to process her experiences of racism. So it's something that she didn't have the vocabulary to process or think about growing up.
Okay. And I think this was one approach to racism in the Black community back in the back in the 20th century. Tazeen, Betty was quickly invited to join the Muslim faith, but demurred. An author wrote, quote, "She told herself that she would not discard years of Sunday school and Bible study for this murky paganism, but she would give the Muslims another listen," close quote. So she went to hear Brother Minister or Malcolm X. Can you elaborate and tell us what happened to her as she moved from the Christianity, Methodism of her youth to Nation of Islam?
Yeah, so Betty first encounters Malcolm in 1956, 2 years before they'd been married, when she was a nursing student in Brooklyn, and she had actually went to like a colleague from her program to a dinner where there was a Nation of Islam meeting that Malcolm would be speaking at. Um, and in interviews, Betty talks about how good the food was at that dinner, and so it was so flavorful. And she compares it to, um, I guess, what would be the more bland food from her days at the Tuskegee Institute. But this is what drives her to want to come back to another meeting. So she doesn't actually get to encounter the minister Malcolm X at that first meeting, but it's the food that motivates her to kind of come back and give it another chance. Um, and she talks about how everyone, especially all the women, would talk about this one minister that all the sisters are really taken with. He was this tall, handsome, eloquent, disciplined, bright man. And so when she first meets him, she already knows this reputation, and she's very taken with his oratory skills. She recalls saying, "Oh, I've never heard anyone speak like this." So we have this effect on her, and of course, many other people, where they also felt driven to be composed in his presence, driven to sit up straight in the front row. So she was very impressed with the way that he spoke with clarity and accessibility, and she remarked that his teachings were very easy to follow, which she contrasted to sort of the other kinds of preaching styles that she had been accustomed to. But it wasn't just the manner in which Malcolm X was speaking. She was also very attracted to his message. It was something that resonated very deeply with her. The themes of, for example, Black self-sufficiency. This is something that she was already very familiar with. She was raised, as we mentioned, by Methodist parents, and she drew connections between the way that her father, who was Methodist, talked about, taking responsibility for yourself. And I mentioned that she was a graduate of Tuskegee, just founded by Booker T. Washington, who was known for this principle of Black self-sufficiency. He promoted this idea that the pathway for racial progress, social progress for Black Americans was to focus on this idea of doing for self. And so that was the environment that she was educated in, the example she had from her parents. So the emphasis, so the ideas that Malcolm X was preaching and that the Nation of Islam stood for, economic independence, that emphasis on sort of carrying yourself with dignity, these were ideas that were appealing to her in large part because they were already familiar with her and they resonated with her. And so when she's asked by her friend who brought her to that first nation meeting, asking, "Why didn't you join?" And she kind of it's like, "Oh, I didn't know this is the kind of thing that you're supposed to join or could join." I forget the exact quote. Like, "Oh, is this the kind of thing that you're supposed to join?" But at the same time, as you indicate, she is kind of evasive because she, later also says like, "Oh, my parents, my mother would have a fit if I joined the nation." So it indicates she clearly had an awareness of what the Nation of Islam was, how it would be, perceived by her family. Um, But I do think ultimately her embrace of joining the nation came through her budding relationship with Malcolm X and processing the racism that she was experiencing um, in New York, what she had experienced in the South, and having somebody like him to share those experiences with and learn from and bring her through this kind of journey of racial consciousness. As we just mentioned, she was pretty shielded from racism and conversations about racism growing up with her parents, so she didn't have a kind of vocabulary to process what she was experiencing in Alabama when she was studying. And this is when she starts to experience racism. And when she's sharing these experiences with Malcolm as her minister, he really made her feel seen and understood, and helped her to sort of develop this kind of racial consciousness. And she especially appreciated the directness with which they could talk about racism with Malcolm, but more generally within the Nation of Islam, because in her upbringing and her family was considered improper to talk about racism. And so in her own recounting, that is, she characterizes her parents as thinking it was bad manners. So she really credits Malcolm X as her teacher. Um, and that's so I should also say that admiration went both ways. Malcolm was also very taken with her and admired her composure and her dedication and her education. But because she'd already had this religious upbringing, it made for a relatively smooth transition in many ways. It rendered her open to the messages that he was preaching because she already came from a religious background, and was already drawn to a lot of the messages of the nation.
Right. That was helpful. But would you be so kind to explain Nation of Islam to our listeners, including Marcus Garvey and Elijah Muhammad? I think many of them won't know much about Nation of Islam.
Yeah, sure. So Marcus Garvey is actually not a part of the Nation of Islam, but he's this key figure in the sense that he was this Jamaican activist whose own organization was the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and that was founded in the early 20th century, 1914. And he preached racial separatism, Black dignity, this back to Africa message. So this was hugely influential. It was one of the largest movements in African American history. And I mentioned Booker T. Washington earlier, that idea of self sufficiency. So Garvey was influenced deeply by Washington in his messages to work hard and do for self and cultivate good character. And this would, be the path that would eventually lead to equality. Um, but with Garvey, he articulated a vision of racial separatism based on the idea that integration would never actually happen. And this was based on his experiences um, of the treatment of African Americans that he observed. So he takes on his take on self sufficiency was that African Americans should return to Africa and build their own nation where they could finally have autonomy. And interestingly, Malcolm X's parents, both his mother and his father, were devoted Garveyites. Their whole marriage was based on their shared commitment to Black freedom struggle. That's how they met in the first place. So these values and commitments to Black nationalism, economic self-sufficiency, these are ideas that Malcolm X was immersed in from birth. And in his autobiography, he talks about going to these UNIA meetings with his father. And similarly with Betty, the reasons why the Nation of Islam appeals to both of them in their different times, is rooted in the value that they were already had extended exposure to, and they had already embraced to some extent. So Black self-respect, the idea that Black folks needed to establish their own institutions. He, was not against segregation. He was all about sort of uplifting the Black race across national borders. So essentially, he preached a kind of Pan-Africanism that was centered around hard work and discipline and gaining economic wealth. And these are ideas that become hugely influential of Islam, which was in part a nation building project to build a Black separatist nation in the U.S. So the Nation of Islam comes a little over a decade after Marcus Garvey founds his organization, it was founded in 1930 in Detroit by a man called W.D. Fard, who was likely South Asian, though in official sort of Nation of Islam accounts, they say that he comes from Mecca. Um, Elijah Muhammad is his assistant. Fard mysteriously disappears in 1934, and Elijah Muhammad becomes the Nation of Islam leader, and it becomes under his leadership, and that's where the Nation of Islam, is sort of established as this comprehensive religious system with rituals and ethical commandments and dietary codes. But essentially, the Nation of Islam combined some Sunni Muslim traditions with African American religious traditions. And there are some key differences between Sunni Islam and the nation in terms of theology and cosmology. So, within the Nation of Islam, they believe that W.D. Fard is God. They call him Allah. They believe that Elijah Muhammad was the messenger of God. And these are theological beliefs that were or are considered heretical to Sunni Muslims, since they violate that first pillar of Sunni Muslim faith, that there is no God but God. And Muhammad, the 7th century Arabian prophet Muhammad, was his final messenger. And the other key distinction is this mythological view of history that white people are the devil. But one way, rather than kind of zeroing in on those kinds of theological differences between Sunni Islam and Nation of Islam, one way to understand and situate those theological and cosmological differences is to actually see how the Nation of Islam presented Islam as a kind of racially uplifting alternative to Christianity to Christianity of the South. That also drew heavily on Christianity as well. So nation members recruited heavily in Black churches. They knew their audiences. They were often quoting from the Bible, and were much more familiar with the Bible than the Quran. So that kind of accounts for like the idea of like W.D. Fard being God, and in terms of sort of appropriating a Christian framework to think about some of these Sunni Muslim tenets. So nation leaders are really able to appropriate traditional Islamic vocabulary into a new religious framework. And again, they were able to frame Islam as a kind of alternative to Christianity, a religion of freedom and social justice, and that expressed their goals for social and political liberation in religious terms. And then Malcolm, who's serving this 10-year prison sentence, and while he's doing that, he's exposed to Elijah Muhammad's teachings, and he becomes his disciple, whose eloquence and charisma, ends up far exceeding that of Elijah Muhammad. So he essentially becomes his right-hand man, his mouthpiece. And Elijah Muhammad is a kind of father figure to him from 1952 when he joins the Nation of Islam, pretty much until they split in 1964.
Okay, that's super helpful. At what point does the Nation of Islam reach its peak membership? Do you know approximately?
That's a good question. It was definitely the numbers exponentially increased after Malcolm X became minister. But it was always kind of hard to keep track of numbers. And I think when folks would ask Malcolm X is on the interview circuit, he would say, those who know wouldn't say, and those who say are, don't actually know. And so it wasn't something that was necessarily public, but I do know that can probably be something that could be easily looked up, but I don't know at the top of my head. I know that it exponentially increased under his sort of recruitment.
Okay. And then it sort of fell off in the late 60s, early 70s. Is that right? Or did it continue to
Yeah,
grow?
so it actually gets disbanded in the early 70s after Elijah Muhammad's successor, his son, Warith Muhammad, takes over. And I think that's in 1975 when he transitions most of these, most of the followers into Sunni Islam. So he's somebody also, so he's credited for transitioning the largest group of African Americans into Sunni Islam. And then he sort of disbands the Nation of Islam that Louis Farrakhan, a couple of years later, starts back up in Elijah Muhammad's vision. And I think the numbers have been smaller ever since.
Okay. I think our listeners will know Louis Farrakhan's name, so thank you. How did Betty's adoptive parents, the Malloys, react to her conversion to Islam and then to her marriage to Malcom X in 1958?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't react well. I mentioned earlier that, in some ways, the nation's appeal to Betty was very organic. It was continuous with some of the values that she'd been raised with in her family, but also like in her education. Her parents, as I mentioned, they're, upper middle class or solidly middle class. And her parents were members of the NAACP, which appealed to middle class Black Americans. They were not the demographic that was sympathetic to the Nation of Islam, which spoke to the more sort of disadvantaged demographic that tended to appeal to poorer urban Black Americans. So although there are resonances with the values that she grew up, particularly the idea of self-reliance, but as you know, they didn't talk about race relations. So the kind of fiery language that Malcolm was using and preaching was not a part of their worldview. So for Betty, it's this relationship to Malcolm and her admiration for him, and the way that his message really spoke to her that helped ease her conversion process. But at the same time, her joining the nation came with real sort of material hardships because her parents essentially give her an ultimatum that she can leave the Muslims or leave the nation, or they'll stop funding her education. So they actually end up cutting her off. They stop paying for her nursing school after she joins the nation. So she has to start working to make ends meet. She's taking on these babysitting jobs. And this is, funnily enough, something that Malcolm X mentions in his autobiography before they're married, that he remarks how striking it was that she never confided in him her financial woes. And I think this endeared her to him. He felt for her, but he was also very impressed at how she carried herself. And so that, that element of dignity and pride and strength in the face of hardship. But yeah, she does end up making amends with her parents at some point before her marriage to Malcolm. Yeah, they do make up at some point before her marriage to Malcolm. I can't imagine that they were a thing of the match, but he mentions in his autobiography that they were friendly towards him, and that Betty had a relationship with them again at that time. So they clearly, eventually made up. But yeah, it's worth noting that her convictions came with these real sort of material and social consequences, which does speak to the strength of her religious convictions at the time. Yeah, I should also mention that Betty joins the nation in 1956. They get married in 58. And so when I said earlier that her entry into the nation was precipitated by her budding relationship with Malcolm, that's different than saying that she did it for him. And so I mean this in the same way that Malcolm was successfully able to recruit so many Black Americans to the Nation of Islam. So Betty was not unique in being inspired and moved to join the nation because of him. And so I think this goes back to your earlier question about numbers, but I think there's I think in the early 50s, the membership of the nation is like in the hundreds. And then, although I don't have the number on where it drops off to later, I do think that in the early 60s, some reports are saying it's something like it's in the tens of thousands. So that's what I meant earlier, and I couldn't think of the number. But in terms of the exponential growth, it's maybe something from like 400 to like 40,000. And Malcolm is a part of that exponential growth. So again, yeah, her conversion is based on the strength of her convictions, which is clearly demonstrated in the way that she remains in the nation even after it causes a rift with her parents, and that's long before there's any talk of marriage between herself and Malcolm.
Okay. How did Betty respond to the Black Muslim protocol for women and also for Black Muslim wives? So once she got Well, for women and then for wives once you got married.
Yeah, so, she actually played a kind of leadership role in their temple, in the Harlem temple, um, especially after she becomes Mrs. Malcolm X. And so she publicly plays her role really well. So she's always very composed in media interviews. She defers to her husband, and in the private sphere as well, right? So she was this devoted wife and mother. And in the Nation of Islam, women's domain was in the domestic sphere. So rearing children, taking care of the household, not playing these public roles of leadership. So even as women like Betty had public leadership roles within the temple for the women's groups, for the women's sort of branches within the nation, but in general, there was this emphasis on women as mothers, this idea of like self-sacrifice, loving others, with self-love. Ultimately, um, this idea of women are the ones that are building, that are birthing the nation. As we think about the Nation of Islam as a nation building project, so their sphere of labor was seen as inside the home. Um, and so, but when we think about the nation, at its core, it's a religious tradition that's invested in nation building. And so the core of that nation building project is the patriarchal family unit. And that's the building block of the nation. And so women are at the center of that. And their role is to, as I just mentioned, birthing Black children, creating future members of that nation, of this nation, and then mothering and rearing them, being in charge of their education, their spiritual education, instilling within them racial pride, discipline, running the household. And so the flip side of that is that men of the nation were expected to be the breadwinners for the family. So they're the ones that were responsible for the economic safety of the family, of physically protecting his wife and his family, to be these leaders of the family unit, and where the family defers to the patriarch, the father's authority. Um, and in that worldview, women are seen as vulnerable and in need of protection by men. Um, and I think women, were eager to buy into those roles because typically, and even within our temporary discourse, the idea of vulnerability, of fragility, of who's worthy of sympathy or empathy is a very racialized question. And Black women, we could argue today even, but certainly in this 1950s, 60s context, Black women were not seen as women worthy of these kinds of emotions. So we can see the appeal for Black women to be seen in this light as worthy of protection, in turn granting their men the ability to be their protectors. And the prospect of being a homemaker, staying home and raising kids was also extremely appealing because it was a privilege. These are women who are typically working to take care of other people's households and families, working maids or cleaners, nannies. So the idea of being home and taking care of their households was all sort of part of this larger goal to restore Black racial dignity. And so I think those traditional gender roles would have appealed to many women in the nation. And they didn't see it so much as teaching women to be submissive, but almost as this idea of they saw the teachings training men to be more responsible. They wanted to see Black men in those dignified roles of the Black father, of the Black husband, seeing how Black men would carry themselves with discipline after joining the nation really appealed to them. So this is a huge contrast from like the single parent, single mother families that many of them had grown up in. So again, like this idea of a coherent family unit was really appealing. And I think for Betty, there was a part of her that readily accepted those norms and terms which were embedded within the nation teachings. But that's not to say there weren't also tensions in Betty's marriage around those very same norms.
Right. In fact, I want to talk a little bit about that. She apparently did sometimes want to work outside the home while at the same time, in some ways, accepting this role of staying home with the children and being protected herself by her husband. And another funny thing I learned is that, not funny, but very specific, is that she wanted to save money for the future. This became a point of friction where Malcolm would say, quote, Allah will provide, close quote. So there's these two tensions, at least, that I have learned about, wanting to work outside the home and wanting to save money. What can you tell us about this? Any further details?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's pretty well documented that Malcolm could be very controlling of Betty and possessive, right? With that role of protector. It's very fine line between being very possessive and sort of strict implementing certain rules and norms. Um, and at the same time, we can think about Malcolm as being controlling, but the Nation of Islam itself was all about enforcing particular behaviors and restrictions and having these strict guidelines that dictated how members could live their lives, like modesty, and dress, like no makeup. These restrictions were again rooted in the idea of like Black self-love, embracing your appearance and skin as it is. Also dietary restrictions like no alcohol, no pork, like chastity. And so within the nation, folks policed each other. So women policed each other, men policed each other. They're routinely like weighed. And so Malcolm and Betty clashed over his controlling behavior, arguments, especially about Betty, as you mentioned, wanting to work. And she actually did interviews where she talks about how they would get into fights, and she actually left him 3 different occasions, but then says she was always really happy when he, ran after her and came back to get her. But that was a tension in their marriage for sure that was related to the experience, the expectations for women in the nation. But there was also this added pressure on her, right? So even as I mentioned, that she, at least partially embraced some of those norms, but she was alone a lot of the time, right? As is the case for a wife who's the wife of this larger than life leader who's answering to communities around the world. He's very busy on the lecture circuit. And she's sharing him with the world. And so he was away from home a lot. And that undoubtedly makes it more difficult to accept these nation norms when she didn't really get to spend time with her husband. And then we also know, as we mentioned, she was formally educated. So she wanted to work and he wasn't home anyway. And so I think she was very frank in private with him, but publicly she upheld what I would, and also, I would argue believed in the nation teachings and values. And on that also, when I mentioned earlier that, it was a privilege, a lot of women might see it as a privilege to be a homemaker, and that was appealing to a lot of Black women in the nation. And I think I mentioned this, that Malcolm and the nation really speak to a kind of urban poor class. And that wasn't Betty's background. So she grew up middle class. So that element of gender roles in the nation were likely not appealing at all. So she was someone who was highly educated and wanted to work outside the home. And she would be working not the jobs that I was mentioning before of like there's children's or cleaning. And so typically the women to whom that idea would appeal to them to be able to stay at home and raise their children are the ones that are doing those kinds of caregiving work outside for other families. But that's not what Betty was envisaging when she said that she wanted to work outside the home. So the question about the tension over money, I think that was a real concern that comes to fruition, right? So I think for Malcolm, he has this refrain, I think you said, oh, Allah will provide. And I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of their different religious worldviews, but rather the Nation of Islam, there's so much emphasis on hierarchy and loyalty. And so we sort of touch on this idea of like a wife's obedience or loyalty to her husband, but the hierarchy also applied to men. And for Malcolm, he was so committed and so loyal to Elijah Muhammad, who he thought as a father. And so when they split, and even when they start to have this rift, I think he's initially blindsided that the Nation of Islam wouldn't be taking care of his family or taking care of him. And so he gives himself in service to Elijah Muhammad. And he's the one that's credited for growing the nation. He never fails to credit Elijah Muhammad any of his speeches. And so there is no part of him that would be able to sort of fathom like the nation not taking care of him and his family financially.
Right.
They paid the mortgage on his house, they owned his car, he kept nothing for himself. And so I think their sort of clash there was sort of his being blinded by this loyalty to somebody who, ends up not having that loyalty towards him. And, as the manager of the household and the one who's bearing and raising these children, she's very rightfully concerned that they're not saving.
Okay. Thank you. That is very helpful. So in 1964, Malcolm X leaves the Nation of Islam and he goes to Mecca for the Hajj and then converted to Sunni Islam. Why did he do these things? So a little bit about Malcolm. And then how did these things affect Betty, including her religious worldview and behavior?
Yeah. So before Malcolm X officially breaks with the nation, there's a period of growing tensions between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. And we might even consider this period of growing tension where Betty is growing increasingly concerned about their finances. But there are a few factors that this tension is attributed to in most accounts. One is kind of this idea of jealousy over Malcolm's celebrity and skills as an orator. Elijah Muhammad was famously not a particularly eloquent person. But the real tangible issue is when Malcolm learns that his mentor and father figure has not lived up to the ethical standards and morals that he preaches. Again, like the Nation of Islam is, living these very strict ethical lives in terms of chastity, diet, all of these things. And so when he learns that Elijah Muhammad has fathered several children with multiple young women secretaries in the nation out of wedlock while he's still married to his wife, Clara Muhammad, it's a kind of a bit of a crisis of faith for him. And at first, he wants to buy into the reasoning that Elijah Muhammad is providing, that he's as the prophet of the Nation of Islam, he's not held to the same standards of regular men. But then Malcolm ends up getting disciplined and suspended from the nation when he makes these offhand remarks about JFK's assassination in a Q&A, unscripted. And they were all, again, thinking about the nation hierarchy, they were all strictly advised not to comment on the assassination. And so Malcolm goes off script in a Q&A, and then he's suspended. And that's when he realizes, when there's a series of things that happen, but that he realizes the relationship has changed. He formally breaks with the nation. And then through his relationships with Muslims from Saudi Arabia, Sudan, he learns about Sunni Islam. He goes on Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, has this extended trip through the Middle East and Africa. His own theological beliefs shift and his political views shift as well. So he returns from this trip and with completely transformed views on how to address the race issue and the plight of Black Americans. And so he establishes a new religious organization called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, pivots to mainstream Sunni Islam, and then he also creates the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And the goal of that is to unite African Americans across the Americas with Africans abroad. And this, of course, affects Betty's life in so many ways. They shift over to Sunni Islam together. So religiously, she has complete faith and confidence in her husband. And there's really no question that she would embrace Malcolm's evolving views alongside him. And she was explicit about the support not being characterized as a kind of blind faith to her or obedience to her husband, but this notion that Malcolm had, over the course of their marriage, proven that he had her best interests at heart, and she loved him and she understood him. And in fact, she was very unhappy with the characterization that Malcolm had done a complete 180 and changed his views on race, because she saw it and he was no longer harbored this racial hatred for white people after Hajj, because she didn't see it as this complete transformation. She thought it was, a kind of natural evolution and expansion of his thought. And so she really bristled at this idea that he preached hate or violence. So she was upholding and protecting his legacy before his death, and as we will, after his death as well. But she's by his side. And of course, the break with the nation means that their livelihood and financial, support is at stake. As we talked about earlier, their family is entirely dependent on the Nation of Islam for everything. So they get an eviction notice for their house, which they appealed. but it was just a really tough period. And she was his main source of support and strength at the time, someone that he really leaned on. And the way that he was publicly criticizing Elijah Muhammad and sort of airing his sins to the world, it was putting her and their kids in danger, which Malcolm was obviously concerned about, but she was shouldering some of that again alone. Um,
Right.
and so she was on this path with him, but the nation had provided her a community and shelter, especially because he was away all the time. And so she also loses that community after his break. And again, like as I mentioned, this trip that you're asking about, where he goes on Hajj and this extended tour through Africa, as he's doing that, she's alone again with their kids. And she's very supportive of him. She's believes in his cause and his journey. But it's a strain, like their house is under security from Malcolm's inner circle. She can't go anywhere without a bodyguard. They're dealing with death threats on the regular, which quickly come to fruition, right? He's assassinated in the first year after he leaves the nation. So it was a tough, vulnerable year, not even full year before the event of his assassination.
Let's move to that event. So on February 21st, 1965, Betty was there with her 4 daughters and pregnant with twins as Malcolm X was giving a speech. He was assassinated. Can you share this tragic story with our listeners, albeit briefly, and what she did, what
Yes.
happened with her?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, that entire year after their family breaks from the nation, it's one that's laden with violence and insecurity, like threats of violence. Um, and they dealt with a lot of harassment, presumably from the nation, where their phone lines were cut off. They're told they had to leave. They're financially very unstable. All of this, um, and so she again is the one that's fielding all those death threats on the phone as he's growing his new organization, calling for Black nationalism and Black unity. And then he's again constantly traveling. And she's at home with a tiny infant, 300 other young children. And just a week before the assassination, their home was actually bombed in the night while they were all sleeping. And so they narrowly escaped that, saving themselves and their children, getting their children out. And they weren't supported by law enforcement at the time. The nation put out a statement that Malcolm had set the fire himself. So Betty and the girls were at that time staying with a friend. Um, and then on the morning of the assassination, Malcolm actually requests that Betty and the girls come to the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem for his scheduled lecture. And she recounts thinking like, oh, that was kind of an odd request because she would always sort of he would always sort of tell her that, it's too risky. She shouldn't come to any of the lectures. But she brings the girls. And again, as you mentioned, she's pregnant with twins. She goes, they're sitting very close to the stage. And again, it's very fresh off the trauma of the bombing of their house. So she sat with her girls there waiting for him to, come to the stage. And no sooner had he started the lecture, there's a disturbance in the audience. And then she, recounts like feeling this rising panic, and there's 3 men lunging at him. And, she hears a shot, like the shooting from a shotgun. And she says she sort of knows like that, he's going to be murdered and with her children at her side. So she watches these bullets pierce her husband's body. He collapses. She's screaming, also shielding her daughters. It's a complete chaos. And, I think in the biography that Russell Rickford one, he mentions that she tries to do CPR on him, but she's hysterical. And she's also talking about in the moment how she's pregnant, just weeping hysterically. So it's just horrific and a central trauma to an already difficult life.
Very, very traumatic. So interestingly, I learned that in the Muslim world, society helps the family of a martyr, but didn't in this case. How did Betty deal with the assassination in the immediate aftermath?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously it was tough because in his death, the papers were still maligning his reputation, right? In terms of like what Malcolm's immediate sort of legacy was. They were saying so the papers were saying he preached violence, that he made that, and that made the experience of mourning even more isolating and difficult. And so even his brothers had sided with Elijah Muhammad. And I think folks at the time were very reluctant to express their support for her assassinated husband because they were scared. They just witnessed what happened to Malcolm. The nation, of course, denies involvement, continue to malign and villainize Malcolm. But Betty continues to carry herself publicly with a lot of composure and strength. And it's not that, in terms of support, it's not that she's not valued by his followers, but they didn't have the financial means to really support her. They were a fledgling organization, and Malcolm's ideological proteges or heirs, like they didn't have like material capital in that sense, but there were relief efforts around her that aimed to sort of keep them going financially. Association of Churches in Harlem that contributed money for their daughter's education, society women, well-established Black society members in New York that led fundraising efforts. So that became her support system for folks who weren't necessarily from her husband's organization.
Okay. Betty wrote of her faith, quote, quitting her, close quote, after Malcolm's death. Then she went to Mecca. Can you tell us about this and its significance to Betty's religious life?
Yeah, so the idea of with that quote, like faith quitting her, I see that as a kind of manifestation of her grief. She describes feeling very lost without Malcolm and now having um, four young daughters, pregnant with two more. I think, you know, we might find it sort of natural for someone's faith to waver or harbor doubts, and she describes that feeling, that period of feeling also like very like unhinged, like that she would talk about like, oh, I could have been like committed to in an institution somewhere. Like she feels like not there. And so it's in this period shortly after his death that she's invited by Ahmed Osman, who's the Sudanese Sunni Muslim, I think he's an economist, who's credited for helping to connect Malcolm into Sunni Islam and organizing his Hajj trip. So he's also the one that makes the funeral arrangements for Malcolm in terms of giving him a Sunni Muslim burial. But she's invited by Osman to go on this extended trip to Geneva and Beirut and then Mecca and complete the Hajj. And he arranges the entire trip for her. It's sponsored by the World Muslim League. And she goes on this trip a month after his death. And so this goes back to the earlier question of the kinds of support that she received in the wake of her husband's martyrdom. And so she was very warmly received by these Saudi dignitaries, bureaucrats, and it felt really great for her to see her husband and his life and legacy be honored in that way, because back at home in the US, he continued to sort of be maligned and misunderstood, but in the press, but he was really venerated in the Muslim world. And then there's that religious dimension as well. She's embarking on this Hajj ritual, and she's a few months pregnant at the time. And, you know, the Hajj pilgrimage is, it's a strenuous one. And her completion of the ritual is a testament to her faith in Islam that she shared with her late husband. So it's a significant moment in her religious life, especially in this period where she's suffering in sort of the shock of her husband's assassination.
Sure. Absolutely. So we learn a few years later, she enrolls, so we're jumping ahead a bit here, in the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and got an EDD several years later. Why did she do this, and what was the significance in her work from then until her death?
So Betty was committed to her children and making sure that they were raised in a very disciplined, strict environment with an emphasis on their education. So strict, healthy eating, all of these values of the Nation of Islam that carry over into the way that she raised her girls. Which brings us back to that idea of Malcolm being strict with her, but she was also this agentic being who believed and saw the value in that regimented lifestyle. So it's clear to all of their daughters that their mother expected and required that they get a college education. So this is the value that she instilled within them. And I think she wanted to be a model for them. This coupled with her, intelligence and proven academic strength already. And so she'd always wanted to work outside the home and had career interests and goals. And she was strong and motivated. And these are the qualities that attracted Malcolm to her. And so they were always her values and a part of her upbringing. So I think the decision to pursue a doctorate was a culmination of all of that, the emphasis on education and upward mobility and material success that she believed in and wanted to for her daughters.
Okay. What were the 1970s like for her and her family? And where do you see, or tell us about the religious thread you see in her life at that time?
So at that point, she was playing a pretty public role on the lecture circuit. She was regularly talking about the plight of African Americans. She was definitely more, um, you might say, moderate in her lectures than Malcolm was, but she was a revolutionary and a civil rights activist in her own right. She fought for education rights and human rights in her own style. Um, and I think you'd mentioned in your intro remark that, she had a master's in public health, so public health administration. And so she worked, as a college administrator until her death. And she raised her daughters with that discipline and conviction and love. And um, these are all sort of stemming from her own religious beliefs, these values that she embodied and also raised her daughters with.
Right. And I think she did some work with Coretta Scott King and the widow of Medgar Evers, right? That they were sort of a threesome that did things together to champion Black equality and things of that nature. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's interesting because we think about these male figures as these incredible, iconic, larger than life leaders, and as we should. Um, but when we think about how all of their lives are so tragically cut short, it's really their wives that are carrying on their legacy and the reason we sort of have, yeah, that have kind of built up their legacies and ensured that they continued. So it's just emphasizing um, how difficult and also how important that role has been in history,
Right.
being the wives of these leaders.
Yes, absolutely. What was her religious life like with her children after Malcolm's death and after her Hajj?
So
What do you
she's
know?
pretty, yeah. I mean, she is somebody who wanted to make sure that her daughters had exposure to Islam, right? So she raised them. She was active in um, the Islamic Center in New York City. So she would take them there. And so they were definitely exposed to those teachings. And so I would say that it was an important part of their upbringing too. So when she, um, I don't know if you can cut this out, but if you still wanted to do the question on her death, right?
I
But
do. I'm getting to that. Yep.
okay, yeah, but so yeah, she made sure that her children were exposed to the teachings of they had teachers from the Islamic Center, a cultural center in New York, and so she exposed them to Muslim teachings.
Okay. Now here, towards the end, Tazine, why don't you tell us the story of her tragic death? It was very tragic. What this meant to her children, and what this meant to the American project and its religious landscape.
Yeah, so sadly, the lives of the family of Malcolm X are all really marked by violence and tragedy and trauma. So as we mentioned, Betty and Malcolm had six daughters. Um, And the second of these daughters was implicated, Kabila Shabazz was implicated in some scandals and personal issues in the mid 90s. She was the subject of an FBI arrest because she was allegedly involved in a plot to kill Louis Farrakhan, who was the leader of the nation. He's, as we talked about, the one who revives Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam after his son disbands it in 1876. And I don't know the extent to which the allegations were ever proven or true, but the charges were that she was involved in this plot to kill Farrakhan in an effort to avenge her father's assassination. And Betty and Louis Farrakhan have a kind of public reconciliation later. But at any rate, Kabila is indicted, and at the time, she's struggling with substance abuse, so she takes a plea deal to get treatment. But her son, so Betty's grandson, also named Malcolm, is sent to live with Betty. And from what I know, the grandson was a troubled child, had some mental health issues, didn't want to be living with his grandmother, and wanted to be with his mom. And so he sets Betty's house on fire, and she's in the hospital for 3 weeks dealing with these third-degree burns all over her body, and she dies in the hospital from those burns. The grandson is 12 years old at the time, and so he's a child. He serves time in juvenile detention. He himself dies very young, violently before, I think, the age of 30. But as an adult, had given interviews about how it was an accident. He had no idea his grandmother would run through the flames to try and get to him. And so it was something that he expressed regret over and remorse for. So this is obviously a massively tragic event to her family and a continuation of all the suffering that her family had endured. And it wasn't just tragic to her immediate family, but also her entire community and friends and civil rights leaders. So she meant so much to so many people. So she was not only married to the most prominent and influential American Muslim leader in history, who was this Black icon of liberation, but she herself was a leader and a model in her own right. So this was a loss to the community.
Thank you. As we conclude, Tazeen, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from Betty Shabazz's life and times, either in terms of important historical transformations you were charting, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, Dr. Betty Shabazz was a leader in her own right. A figure like her, and you mentioned before, Coretta Scott King, these are prominent civil rights royalty whose legacies are sometimes subsumed in the shadows of their husbands. But in both of their cases, because their husbands' lives are so short, when we think about the impact of the teachings of these men, like their wives are so integral to preserving and spreading their teachings. And so Betty is a key part of the equation in the preservation of Malcolm's legacy. And so indeed, like the Shabazz Memorial Center in New York City, it's a memorial to both Malcolm and Betty, which is a testament to her role and this joint legacy they leave behind. So she was committed to her husband's work as his widow, as we mentioned, through speaking events, the way that she raised her kids. She made frequent appearances at events and plays and films that were based on her husband's life and work. And so she committed to this public life, and those are all choices that she made, right? So she carried on Malcolm's legacy because she believed in him and his message and what he stood for. And she continued to speak on his teachings throughout her life. And so, as I mentioned, like with her death, it was the loss of another Black leader. Um, and beyond that, I want to sort of end with this acknowledgement of her being this model of a Muslim woman as an exemplar um, Black Muslim woman who is highly educated, smart, independent, gracious, graceful person who raised six daughters on her own. She never remarried, while also working towards a doctorate and having this successful, career as a university leader, a community leader. And I think often, and this happens with Malcolm X in some intellectual circles as well, but there's a kind of erasure of his Islam or of his Muslimness in an emphasis sort of on his Black nationalism. But his work was motivated by his Islam, by his faith, and his pivot to Sunni Islam was also the moment of his pivoting towards this broader international framework where we saw he starts drawing connections between Black liberation struggle in the US to the struggles of colonized people all over the world, to connect Muslim struggles around the globe, connecting Black American liberation to Palestine, for example. And so the connections of racial oppression of Black Americans and the legacies of European colonization. So the erasure or downplaying his Muslimness is just factually incorrect. And I raise that now in our discussion of Betty to wrap up, because I think there's a similar move, maybe even more overt, move to erase her Muslimness or translate it as somehow not authentically Muslim or more spiritual than religious in an effort to kind of downplay her religiosity. And I think biographers often do this, but the fact is that she and Malcolm together embraced Sunni Islam. And after his death, we talked about her going on Hajj. And upon her death, she had a Muslim burial. Her janazah, the Muslim funeral service, was held at the Islamic Cultural Center in New York City, where she would bring her daughters to teach them about Islam. So she died as a Muslim, as a Sunni Muslim, and today serves as an important role model for Muslim women. And I think emphasizing her identity as a Muslim woman helps us also to reverse the broader erasure of Black Muslims in these general treatments of Muslims in the U.S. So that's something that I want to end with.
Thank you very much. Well said, and thank you for that. We've been talking with Tazeen Ali, Assistant Professor of Religion and Politics at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University at St. Louis. Listeners, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, as I did, please write a review. Tazeen, thank you so very much for giving your time to help us understand the life and times of Dr. Betty Shabazz, which in turn better equips us to perfect and perpetuate the American experiment in self-government. It was informative and enlightening, and I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.